Casa Paleologu.
Bine v-am regăsit ca în fiecare marți în emisiunea Metope. Astăzi am un invitat cu totul special. I have a very special guest. O să vorbesc în engleză. I will speak in English. Our guest today is Andreas Umland, whom I have known for, I don't know him how many years, 17 years maybe. It was in the mid 2000 something. We met in Berlin. At that time, I think you were moving to Kiev, or in any case, you were teaching in Kiev. You live in Kiev. Andreas Umland lives since, I don't know when exactly, maybe 17 years, if I'm not wrong, in Kiev. So now you are in Kiev, and Andreas Umland is a researcher, an analyst at the Stockholm Center of Eastern European Studies. So thank you very much, Andreas, for accepting my invitation. I think that many people want to speak to you because you are a remarkable scholar in the field of Russian studies and Ukrainian studies, and also you live there, so you have you are very precious for two reasons. You are there, and also you have studied Russia and Ukraine as a topic of academic research.
Yes, thanks, Theodor, for having me. I'm very happy to be on this program here for you after such a long acquaintance or friendship that we have. So I'm honored to be here.
So how is it to live in Kiev right now? What is the atmosphere? I mean, we think all the time about you. I have to confess that every day in the morning when I wake up, the first thing I do is to see if something new has happened in Russia, in Ukraine, in the Donbass. We are following very closely everything that happens in Ukraine, and so please give us your impressions, the atmosphere.
Well, I guess one has to make a distinction here between eastern and southern Ukraine on the one side and cities like Kiev or western Ukraine on the other, where I don't think there is an immediate threat to these central Ukrainian, western Ukrainian cities. But if I would be living in Mariupol, or even, which is right on the contact line, or even in cities like Kharkiv or Dnipro or Mykolaiv, I would be much more nervous. The Kiev daily life is basically as ever. There's very little change, actually, although one can already feel the economic repercussions of the current tensions, because investors, capital, companies are leaving Ukraine, and Ukraine is already having significant economic problems because of that. So this is already now problematic for Ukraine. But we are still hoping that there will be no military escalation or no major military escalation, and that perhaps with this sort of recognition of these two pseudo-states, the so-called people's republics, that we will stay at this level and will not see further invasion.
But now the Russian army can move in. Can move in officially. The Russian army was already there, but now it's a different situation. No, what the recognition happened yesterday. Everybody was expecting this. What's next from the Russian side and also from the Ukrainian side?
Well, from the Ukrainian side, I think that's a very short answer. The Ukraine is preparing for defense, for defending the country, and what will happen from the Russian side, that is, well, somebody perhaps to ask in Moscow, and my impression is actually that even many Moscow experts there, they don't know anymore. So the communication is limited between the Kremlin and civil society and media, and the circle of people who are making decisions in the Kremlin is very small, and so it's anybody's guess what will happen further. There are various escalation scenarios. for eastern Ukraine, for southern Ukraine, even for northern Ukraine, because there are now large troops as well in Belarus. And it's anybody's guess how far Putin will go. And I think a lot will depend on how the West will react to what has already happened, and how credible the Western sort of threat of retaliation, economic retaliation above all, will be.
But is Putin not expecting a mistake on the Ukrainian side? I'm thinking of the scenario in 2008 in Georgia. So waiting for a mistake in order to have a pretext for intervention. Is it a, plausible hypothesis?
Yes, perhaps he is hoping for a mistake from the Ukrainian side, but I think the Ukrainians, they are very cautious now, and that is all the rhetoric that comes from the president, from the foreign minister, that we are not escalating, we are not provoking, we are not interested in military escalation, but Russia could launch some sort of false flag operation. They can always create an incident, a casus belli, if they want to invade. So it's more a question of whether they want to, whether they're ready to bear the costs and the risks of an invasion. And I hope now that the situation is now different from 2008 from Georgia, that the risks and costs are now larger, and that they are also assessed as larger in the Kremlin. The speech yesterday by Dmitry Medvedev, who was at this infamous Security Council session, seems to indicate that the risk assessment is not very sort of serious so far in Russia, because he indicated that they are expecting a story similar to what happened in 2008 with Georgia, that there would be first critique and outrage and so on, but then eventually the West would get back to business as usual. And if the West gives this impression that the punishment will be limited, or by time or by range, then indeed I would expect an escalation. But if the risk assessment is different in Moscow, then I would hope that we can still avoid a larger military confrontation.
But some of the declarations of Russian officials give the impression that they have a profound contempt for the West. The West being coward, undecided, disunited, decadent, whatever. And maybe this contempt for the West is actually a great risk, in the sense that the Russian side may underestimate the willingness of the West to resist and to take action. What do you think about this? And another important question is the West really united? Or enough, or not enough?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I totally agree. I mean, that is the problem in a way, that Russia may be both underestimating the Western resoluteness and unity, and also the Ukrainian resoluteness and ability to defend itself. In a way, I think something like that had actually happened in 2014, when there was this plan of a new Russia, Novorossiya, basically the dream of conquering of most of the East Ukrainian and South Ukrainian lands that are defined as Novorossiya, as New Russia, which did not happen. There were a few disturbances in Odessa, in Mykolaiv, and other cities, but basically the Russian plan only worked in the Donbas, in Donetsk and Luhansk, and even there, Russia had to actually insert their special units and irregular units, fighters that were guided by Moscow. There's now research about the start of this pseudo-civil war by Russian agents that were irregulars. Many of them were irregulars. They were not actually employees of the Russian state, or at least not official employees of the Russian state, but they were in constant contact with the Russian state. and therefore this war was from the beginning not a civil war, but a theater of a civil war, if you like. But then the Ukrainians got together and got their act together, and then they actually went into an offensive, and then Russia had to actually invade with regular troops in late August 2014 to prevent a defeat of the irregular forces it had in Ukraine. And the same happened then again in February 2015. So there was already this sort of underestimation of the Ukrainian state, and now that could happen again, that Russia may think of all of this as being too easy and too quick.
But this view of Ukraine as being an artificial state was very obvious in yesterday's speech of President Putin. He said basically that Ukraine is completely artificial. It is a creation of Lenin. He said Lenin is the author and the architect of Ukraine, that Ukraine should change its name into the Lenin Republic of Ukraine. I mean, he gave a lecture on history. By the way, I want to say that Andreas Umland will give a lecture at Casa Paleologu precisely on Putin's rewriting of history. And Andreas, you have an excellent example just now. This speech, 1 hour speech, a long speech with a long part on history, saying that basically Ukraine is completely artificial. And it was created by Lenin. Then Stalin gave to Ukraine parts of Poland, Romania, and Hungary, which I find very interesting. I mean, it's a kind of sign towards Romania, Hungary, and Poland. Probably it will be more successful with Viktor Orban. But I find it quite interesting. I mean, this attempt to weaken the front, maybe in Romania, maybe in Poland, maybe in Hungary. Some people will think, that's the moment to take back some of our territories.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in a way he is right, but many countries of the world are sort of in a certain way artificial. The borders are very new. Territories belong to other countries. There were colonies of empires. They had only short periods of independence. They did not have proper states for a long time. This is nothing actually unusual. If you think that through, then you could actually ask about many countries in the world, whether they have a right to exist in their current borders, at least. And that's the same with Ukraine. But Ukraine is an old cultural nation. It existed first in the Tsarist Empire, then in the Soviet Empire. And indeed, then the borders that were then also the borders of the new Ukrainian state that emerged in 1991 are somewhat artificial or accidental, if you like, as of all the other Soviet republics, including also the Russian Federation, and because the agreement was just in 1991 to not question these borders, although these were Lenin's and Stalin's borders. And in that way, indeed, Lenin could be said to be responsible for the current Ukrainian borders, and even Stalin, you could argue, is involved in that. So it's I think it's made an argument for people not very familiar with history, and that these sort of discourses, they are actually quite universal. There are, you can find them in many countries where, nationalists usually are unhappy with their country's borders and think that they should be actually much larger, and that there has been so much historical injustice. And that is the standard argument also for military aggression in history, that there is something, some historical failure, error that needs to be corrected, and that's why this or that military invasion is allegedly justified. The viciousness of this attack is indeed surprising. It has something psychopathological almost. It's although you would think that as a Russian there should be sympathy for the Ukrainians as a close nation with which is actually in many ways similar. The Ukrainians have a Cyrillic alphabet, also an Orthodox Church. They are Eastern Slavs. there's lots of commonality actually, but nevertheless enormous viciousness on the side of Putin and also of other Russian nationalists who simply don't want to see that there is actually a Ukrainian nation with its own culture, its own literature, its own music, its own folklore, its own political traditions and philosophical thought and so on. It's just like any other nation in the world, and partly Putin has been successful in impressing on Western observers that Ukraine is not a real nation, or that because they don't know much about Ukraine, and also they don't know much about the other Soviet republics, because their nationhood was suppressed both under the Tsarist and Soviet empires, and that's why they have now problems, so to say, to make themselves be heard. I mean, Moldova, that you know of course much better than me, is perhaps the prime example where Russia is already for 30 years undermining the integrity of the state, is sort of claiming that it has some sort of special rights there, and is financing and supporting this pseudo state in Transnistria. So.
By the way, Andreas, some of the agents that have been at work in the Donbas region came from Transnistria.
Yes.
There are some GRU officers who had been already in Transnistria, so they have a very good experience with this kind of conflicts.
Okay. Yeah, and that illustrates just that, there's nothing unique here about the situation. It's just a repetition of things that had earlier happened to Moldova, to Georgia. Now we have this new situation in Belarus for the last two years. It's the old imperial nation that does not want to acknowledge that the empire is over. That is also not something that's unusual actually in world history. So I think we should be more in a comparative perspective, look on all of this, and then much of this sort of Putinist rhetoric actually very easily one can detect very easily these some sort of common traits of neo-imperial or post-imperial thinking that one can also find in other time periods in other parts of the world, where similar arguments have been made to have some sort of revanche or revision of borders.
You said something very important, I think, about the Ukrainian nation, the nationhood of Ukraine. And indeed, many people, and many educated people believe that there is no such a thing as a Ukrainian nation. They say Kiev is the origin of Russia. There is the Kievan Russia, Rusia Kieviana in Romanian. So, and it's hard to fight against these preconceptions. Kiev became part of the Russian emerging empire in 1654 after the revolt of Bogdan Khmelnytsky. 1654. The Kievan Rus is in the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, beginning of the 13th century. So between the 13th century, early 13th century, and the late 17th century, there are several hundred years. I mean, it's a completely different history. And many people believe there is no such thing as a Ukrainian nation, even important politicians in the West. So I think that the speech of Putin has actually three different audiences. One, internal audience for the Russian nation, to show how strong a man Putin is. A Ukrainian audience, either to frighten the Ukrainians or to seduce some of them, and equally a Western audience, people who, like I said, have no idea whatsoever about Ukrainian history and who believe these kind of things.
Yes, unfortunately, there is an audience for that, which has a lot to do with the sort of better marketing, one could argue, of Russian culture under both the Tsarist and the Soviet empires, and the suppression of the non-Russian nationalities in the empires, which have now become states, and that's why people, they cannot, they don't know what Belarusian is or Georgian or Ukrainian. Although if you live in the country, you see very clearly that there is something very distinct and actually something very similar. Just that Ukraine is a nation as any other nation, with its own language, which is actually different, very different from Russian. It's maybe something like German and Dutch. There's similarities, but there are also differences. And then you simply, I don't even know what to say on this. It's just an assertion that flies so much against reality that if you don't want to see what is there, then you can't help with that. And this quarrel around Kiev, it's odd. I mean, the Russians are also an Eastern Slavic nation, and they have an Orthodox church, and perhaps you can sort of link that somehow to the Kievan Rus, but what does that mean? That you cannot construct out of this some sort of claim. I mean, the whole discussion is in a way ridiculous, because these sort of modern understanding of nations, they are of course very young only. We think, there's this projection in the past that, people like 500 years ago, they thought of themselves as Russians or Ukrainians or something. People did not think in these ways back then. This is just a projection. And then there are these narratives that are actually fairy tales that tell a story that is simply not there, because nations are a relatively young phenomenon in world history. That that most nations have only started to define themselves as nations within the 200 or even at most 300 years. So much of this is actually very, very strange.
Yes, projecting the idea of nationality before the year 1000, because Vladimir was in the 9th century.
It was actually Volodymyr. It wasn't actually Vladimir. And yeah. So and now there is this monument for Volodymyr in Moscow, and a Swedish.
It's huge.
Yeah,
I mean,
a Swedish colleague has told me actually that oddly, this is actually you could argue that this is a Swedish king, because he was born in Kiev, but he actually lived most of his life in Sweden. He's a Viking, and so this and there are now these fairy tales about him, and that he's apparently sort of a forefather of the current Vladimir. I mean, this is just
an avatar.
Yes.
A reincarnation
Yeah.
of the old Knyaz, the saint Knyaz Vladimir. But I want to ask another question about the prospects of Ukraine to join NATO and the Ukrainian and the European Union, because there are people in NATO, mostly in NATO, I would say, who rather avoid the prospect of having Ukraine in. There was and there is an opposition. So what are the prospects? I mean, I understand Ukrainians want to be protected. We did the same. Actually, we wanted to join NATO. Again, this is a completely distorted perception on the Russian side. The idea that we have been conquered by the United States. The idea of NATO expansion did not come from Washington. It came from Prague and Warsaw. The first people who spoke about the extension of NATO were Havel and Walesa. And then we also joined the movement. So I fully understand the desire of the Ukrainians to join NATO in order to be protected against whom it's quite obvious. What are really the prospects? Because some countries in Europe are rather reluctant.
Well, one can understand it. Now, I just want to maybe add another sort of element to this mythology of NATO expansion, that at first, the desire of the East Central European countries to enter NATO was rejected. Actually, they came. They were basically knocking at NATO's door, and NATO said, there would be no enlargement. And then there was actually the idea of creating a NATO number 2, NATO bis, in Eastern Europe, a sort of an East European NATO for all the countries that, as it looked in the early 1990s, would not be able to enter NATO because NATO was not yet ready to take them. And then it was actually a German politician, Volker Rühe, then if I remember that right, the defense minister of Germany, who then brought up the idea that, for German interests, it would be good actually if Poland and the Czech Republic become NATO members, because, that would increase the security of Germany. And then it became slowly more popular than the diasporas in the US. The Polish diaspora especially was very active in promoting the idea. That's how the NATO enlargement started, and not from somebody in Washington or in Brussels saying now we need to enlarge our organization. Yeah, unfortunately, Ukraine missed this train. Ukraine should have, I think, in 1994, when it was agreeing to give up its nuclear weapons, simply said, if we give up our nuclear weapons, we have to become NATO members. And then I think Ukraine would have entered, because that was so high then on the Western agenda to get rid of the nuclear weapons in Ukraine, also in Belarus and Kazakhstan, that I think the West would have done almost anything to get rid of these weapons. Instead, Ukraine only got this by now infamous Budapest memorandum, where with the so-called security assurances or security guarantees, which is not, however, a military alliance. Britain and the US are signatories of this memorandum, and but it's not a mutual aid pact. It's just a confirmation that these countries, including Russia, would not attack Ukraine or exert pressure on Ukraine. Russia has now broken this promise from 1994, has thereby been undermining the nuclear non-proliferation regime. But Ukraine has no claim of a mutual or of military assistance from Britain or from the US on the basis of the Budapest Memorandum. Well, and then when Ukraine came with the idea and applied in 2008 together with Georgia for membership, then it was too late. Then already, especially the West European countries were fearing Russia, and they didn't want to enrage Putin, who had in 2007 given his infamous speech at the Munich conference. And so then Ukraine got this, and Georgia, they got this odd membership promise in the Bucharest Declaration from 2008, but no membership action plan or no specification when and how actually these countries would enter NATO. And now I'm afraid what I'm telling Ukrainians usually quite openly and very frankly and frustratingly is that Ukraine may only become a NATO member when it does not need NATO anymore. So that is unfortunately what I'm afraid will happen. Once the conflict...
Can you elaborate a little bit more? What does it mean?
Well, Ukraine needs needs NATO above all for protection against Russia, and because of the conflict now. And once the conflict is resolved, and Russia has become a normal nation state without imperial ambition towards
when?
Yeah, well, I don't know when, but one day I think it will happen, and then Ukraine will become member of NATO. But then it won't need it that much anymore. So that's the odd situation in which now Ukraine has found itself. I'm afraid the same goes for Georgia.
Mm-hmm. So you say basically that the prospects are very low.
Even without this whole escalation now and Putin's desires, as long as there is this conflict with Russia, there will be always some of the 30 countries, member countries, and all of them have to agree that will not want to enter this conflict.
And what about EU membership then?
That's a different story, and that's also what I'm trying to say, Ukrainians, that the EU is formally also a defense unity, a defense union, Now it has a special article that is very similar, actually, to the Washington Treaty Article number 5, which is about mutual aid, military aid. But it's not a military alliance. So so the EU is a very different animal, actually, and I think there Ukraine has better chances to enter, and it should get the membership perspective. And it would also be much more difficult for the Kremlin to argue against an EU membership of countries like Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, because you could then not construct easily some sort of existential geopolitical threat for Russia, because the European Union is not a military sort of organization. So I think that's actually the way to go. And
yes, Andreas, but the conflict in 2013 started with over the issue of association with the European Union. That's how everything started in November 2013, when Yanukovych gave up on signing the treaty, the agreement.
Yes. Yeah, and the EU is here a threat to the current Russian regime because of its values, because of the democracy promotion that it is engaged in, promotion of rule of law, and so on. And this is all for the current regime a threat. But it, and that's why Russia is against this, and has also, for instance, forbidden Armenia, its ally, to sign an association agreement, a full-scale association agreement with the European Union. And Armenia was for a while engaged in the same negotiations as Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine for a similar large association agreement. But then in September 2013, Armenian President Sargsyan met Putin, and then came out and said, we will enter the Eurasian Economic Union, which then meant that Armenia would not get an association agreement with the European Union. They now got an extended cooperation agreement, but it has a different sort of meaning than the association agreements of Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine.
We have to take a break for publicity, and then we finish our discussion.
Okay.
Vine primăvara, se așterne în toată țara și în casa ta. Primăvara, da, cu flori și căldură, dar fără puf, praf sau murdărie. Pentru că acum cureți și dezinfectezi toate tipurile de suprafețe dure cu Kierher. De la podea la hotă, cuptor, geamuri, oglinzi, rosturi, obiecte sanitare sau chiar jucăriile copiilor rătăcite pe sub canapea. Da, cu un singur aparat de curățat cu aburi de la Kierher. Fără substanțe chimice, fără mirosuri puternice, cu puterea și temperatura aburului. La cald și bine și curat. În gherila de dimineață, spune-ne cu ce ai începe curățenia de primăvară a vieții tale și Kierher te premiază. Kierher, curățenia de primăvară niciodată mai ușoară.
Acum ai mai mult gust autentic Mac cu un meniu din partea noastră. Cumpără 3 meniuri Maxi și primești încă unul din partea noastră. Ofertă valabilă în perioada 16 februarie-16 martie. Doar la McDrive.
El universo entero escucha.
Ce anume se poate realiza pe o suprafață de 110 metri pătrați construiți? Se poate amenaja o locuință, un magazin, o farmacie sau poate funcționa o uzină. O uzină care produce seri de concerte live în miros de cafea prăjită peste zi. Uzina Coffee din Amzei 5. Uzina care produce timp de calitate, timpul tău. E bine să-ți rezervi un loc din vreme, un spațiu mic pus pe evenimente mari. Pentru tine, în Amzei 5. Uzina Coffee este avampost Radio Guerilla.
Metope. Emisiune realizată prin amabilitatea Fundației Casa Paleologu.
We are back for the last minutes of our discussion. Andreas, we're speaking about oppositions in the West, in the Western countries, towards an accession to NATO of Ukraine. I'm following, very closely the French elections, for instance, the French politics in general. And I see that, Macron tried to play a role as a negotiator. That's very nice. I mean, it's a very good project. But we have to remember that Macron himself has said about NATO that is en mort cérébral, almost dead. I don't know how to say in English, but cerebral death. No, so it's a very strong statement. Among the most important candidates in the French elections, you have Mélenchon, Zemmour, and Marine Le Pen saying that France should leave NATO, or at least the military organization. So that's what Zemmour says. Mélenchon says we should leave it altogether. So you have at least 45% of the, I mean, over 40% of the people who are attracted by people who say these kind of things. So, I mean, it's quite problematic. I mean, it's one of the most important countries in the alliance. Maybe the same is true to a lesser degree in other countries of Europe, in Italy, in Austria, in Germany as well, either on the left or the right. So this is quite worrying.
Yes, I'm also worried by that. Still, I think there's usually more talk than action. We had already a phase when France was not part of the military organization, so it wouldn't actually change that much. So I'm not that worried about the problem here for Ukraine is simply that it's now.
Andreas, wait a second. In principle, I would say the same. Okay, Zemmour says that France should go out of the military organization of NATO, as Le Général de Gaulle has done in the 60s. Fine. But the timing is not ideal. I mean, we are in a major crisis, in the middle of a major crisis, the Ukrainian crisis. And we hear someone saying that France should leave the military organization. Maybe in principle we can, agree or disagree, whatever. It's a debatable issue, but the timing is disastrous. It gives a very bad sign, I would say. No?
Yes, I agree. But, I've encountered that many times also in Germany, that simply the threat perception and the crisis perception is in Western Europe, at least in continental Western Europe, very different from Eastern Europe. And, there's a different geopolitical thinking. And I'm now working for a Swedish think tank, and I'm actually pleasantly surprised how sort of realistic the Swedes are thinking about world politics. Sweden is not a member of NATO, but it's it has a very clear sort of
and
view.
Are they going to join NATO?
It could happen. It's a topic in Sweden. It's not a trivial issue. It's not a joke. And there have been waves of discussion of this, and now there is perhaps a new wave with this Russian claim that Finland and Sweden should not enter NATO. But unfortunately, in Western Europe, especially in countries like Germany and Italy and France and also the Netherlands and so on, there is a perception that, what's happening in Eastern Europe is far away. It's, all these, strange peoples there.
How can we counter this kind of perception? What are the arguments? Because I also know people like this. What should I tell them? What should we tell them?
Well, one argument that I'm often sort of proposing is the importance, we've already talked about it, of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict for the nuclear non-proliferation regime, because it puts the whole logic of this fundamental agreement of humanity. It's one of the, I would say, most important treaties that the world has, about the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. It puts the logic on its head, because Russia has been doing what it has been doing because it has nuclear weapons, and it is explicitly allowed to have nuclear weapons. And what has happened to Ukraine has happened because Ukraine does not have nuclear weapons. And moreover, Ukraine is forbidden to have nuclear weapons. And surprise, surprise, a nuclear weapons state under the non-proliferation regime increases the territory at the expense of a non-nuclear weapons state. And even more so, Ukraine once had a nuclear arsenal that it gave up. And in naively believing in the validity of the nuclear non-proliferation regime, that actually foresees that the non-nuclear weapons state would be protected from the nuclear weapons states. And if you have this situation, then this may have large repercussions across the world, because there may be many political leaders who will be looking on Ukraine and will be looking on Russia, and they will be thinking, we are not going to be as stupid as the Ukrainians. Instead, we're going to be as smart as the Russians, and we are not going to lose.
And North Korea is a good example.
yeah, the North Koreans are very smart people, and so and maybe we may actually be as smart as the Russians and can actually increase our territory, as the Russians did, just snatching from a weaker country quickly when the opportunity arises a prime piece of land, and then saying, whoever interferes with us, will feel that we are nuclear weapons state, and that breaks the whole logic of the regime down, and that is very dangerous for humanity, because currently the proliferation of nuclear weapons is of course limited not only by the regime but also because the production of nuclear weapons is expensive. But imagine that in 20 years there will be some new disruptive technologies which allows you to produce a nuclear weapon, with a small, in the garage, basically. And then we could get into a very dangerous situation when this nuclear non-proliferation regime does not function anymore. And we may then get lots of countries with nuclear weapons and all sorts of risks that go, of course, along with this. That is one argument.
It's a very strong argument. Thank you very much for this discussion. And I remind everybody that Andreas Umland will give a course at Casa Paleologu on Putin's rewriting of history on the 26th of February,
yes,
if I'm not mistaken. So soon. And be prepared for the course. Not you, those who will come, who will join the course. There are some interesting books that have been recently published in Romanian. Galeotti, Let's Talk About Putin. There is also the book of Françoise Thom about Putin și putinismul, comprendre Putin, le putinisme in French, and Timothy Snyder as well, The Road to Unfreedom, drumul către libertate, was also published in Romanian. So there are some very interesting books that have been published in Romanian recently. Andreas, see you soon. See you on the 26th. And thank you again. Thank you very much. And follow with great care everything that happens to our east. And all our sympathies on your side. I mean,